True to one man, sizzle in my soul.
Hi everyone, welcome to One Last Good Story. I'm Bill McDade. Here's how our podcast works. Every episode, we'll explore a piece of the world we didn't know was missing. Then we'll end on a high note, one last good story. Today, we have a mystery that we'll explore. We'll start on a small island in the South Pacific and then cut to a field of lavender in southern France. We'll follow that up with a look at a dead genius who spent his last years talking to pigeons, and then wrap our arms around a question that the best archaeologists and geneticists on Earth still can't fully answer. All four tie together, I promise you that. Let's begin. Part 1. The island, the mounds, and unexplained construction. In 1774, Captain James Cook was on his second voyage of the Pacific, his third crossing of that enormous ocean, and he spotted an island he had never seen charted before. It was covered with a species of tree, unlike anything in his experience, columnar pines. They were 90 feet tall, and they grew in such a rigid vertical formation that from the water, they looked like a standing army. He saw smoke from fires on the island. Someone was home. So he didn't stop, but instead named it the Isle of Pines and kept sailing. Now, Cook was a meticulous man. His logs are still admired for their precision. And the fact that he bothered to name that place and kept moving says something about his pace of exploration. There were other known anchorages he needed and provisions to stock up on, and time was ticking away. The Isle of Pines was a notation for Cook, not a destination. For the next 2 centuries, the island remained what it looked like then, beautiful, remote, and inhabited by the Kanak people, who were descended from the Lapita. It became French territory in the archipelago of New Caledonia, that's north of Australia and south of the Solomon Islands. And eventually, when World War II touched it briefly, they built an airfield, some fortifications, and nothing else. The island went back to being a beautiful and remote home for the descendants of the Lapita peoples. Then in the 1950s, workers repairing a road near the island's landing strip hit something hard that they didn't expect. It wasn't buried treasure or graves, not anything they had a name for, really. They hit a cylinder of concrete, standing upright in the earth. Now, the Kanak had known about these mounds for generations. From the air, the central iron plateau of the island looks as if it's been pockmarked with dozens of low gravel humps, about 7 to 10 feet high, 30 to 50 meters across. And the Kanak called them the work of spirits or ancestors from elsewhere, not the Lapita. The precise translation really depends on the elder you're speaking to, but the consistent point is that nobody claimed that their own people or ancestors built them. In 1959, French archaeologist Luc Chevalier, curator of the New Caledonian Museum, began excavating these mounds. What the road crew had exposed was the first in a series of finds that Chevalier would spend years trying to explain and ultimately couldn't, at least not to everyone's satisfaction. Here's what was inside the mounds: a cylinder structure, roughly 9 feet tall and between 3 to 7 feet wide, made of mortar, not modern concrete exactly, but a compound high in calcium oxide and silica mixed with the shells of Placostylus, or large land snails. And he also found iron nodules and rings. Running through the center of each structure was a vertical shaft, a hole, that was approximately 12 to 20 inches in diameter and was reinforced with iron ore, and it ended in an iron cone at the base. Chevalier eventually mapped and cataloged over 400 of these mounds across the island. Some had single cylinders, a few paired cylinders, and some were oval, but not one contained anything like a burial. As a matter of fact, not one mound had any artifacts. There were no tools, no pottery, no bone, no charcoal to be found. The structures were mostly empty. As Chevalier wrote in his 1963 report, these structures are human-made, but their purpose remains elusive. The labor involved is significant to create them, he said. It required 200 cubic meters, or about 200 cubic yards, per tumulus of material, and he suggested that an organized society with advanced knowledge of mortar is required. So according to Chevalier, someone or something built 400 of these mounds for some purpose or for some reason. Then in 1960, an Australian archaeologist, Jack Golson, from the Australian National University, brought different methods to the question. He excavated 4 mounds, confirmed Chevalier's findings, and then resisted the easy conclusion that, well, these were probably Lapita culture constructions from about 1350 BCE. Instead, Golson persisted, and he used the latest carbon dating techniques available to him. To his surprise, Golson's radiocarbon dates created more unanswered questions, some questions that still remain today. Golson's dating revealed that the concrete and iron mounds were 7,710 years before the present. And one analysis from a tumulus at Peta on the New Caledonian mainland returned a date of 12,900 years ago, plus or minus 450 years. That places the mounds at around 11,000 BCE, or about a few hundred years before the Younger Dryas period began. Now for reference and perspective, and to see just how contradictory these scientific claims and dates were and are to the accepted human history, the oldest pyramid in Egypt, according to mainstream archaeology, is roughly 4,600 years old. Stonehenge's first stones went up approximately 5,000 years ago. And the earliest known concrete in the archaeological record before the tumuli mounds were discovered and dated are around 300 BCE. They're the Roman opus cementitium. Yale researchers confirmed the samples provided by Golson, and the Tumuli Mound dates have not been successfully challenged by science. The concrete cylinders on the Isle of Pines predate, well, everything. Now, skeptics have legitimate arguments that should be considered. So snail shells could be older material, churned up from deeper sediment by construction, producing a false date. And contamination is a real problem in tropical archaeology, I have been told. Mainstream archaeology has not budged. They currently tie these structures to the Lapita culture that came before the Kanaks roughly 3,000 years ago. And that is the currently academically accepted position. Just like geocentrism was academically accepted for over 1,000 years until it was disproved, and also just like the static universe theory was believed to be true and was accepted by Einstein and other scientists until Dr. Hubble came along and disproved it in the early 20th century. And there are many, many other examples of theories that were accepted as true and later came to be understood as completely false. Go ahead and search for yourself. But keep listening here. There is more. So Dr. Jack Golson, the Australian, he didn't dismiss those older numbers. He flagged them and he said, look harder. 400 anomalous concrete structures sit in the South Pacific with iron cones at their bases and vertical shafts through their centers. And so far, the scientific community hasn't acknowledged the very real challenge to their established historical human timeline. That's a question that perplexes me. But the Kanak know the truth. They haven't deviated from what they believe or have said. What's been passed down for generations by the Kanak, their oral tradition continues to be consistent. These mounds were not built by their ancestors, the Lapita. They were already here when the ancestors arrived. This raises a deeper question. So who was in the Pacific before the time of the pyramids? Perhaps even before the Younger Dryas era? And when exactly did they get here? Well, Kilu Cave on Buka Island in the Solomons, which is 1,000 miles north of New Caledonia, that was excavated in 1987 by archaeologist Stephen Wickler. The lower levels of that cave contain some tools, shell middens, which are discarded piles of shellfish, and starch residues from plant processing. And those are dated to 28,000 years ago during the Pleistocene, in the last period of several thousand years before the Earth warmed up again in 9,700 BCE. And the Solomon Islands sit behind a deep water channel that remained a barrier even when the Pleistocene sea levels were 140 yards lower than today. So whoever reached Buka 28,000 years ago crossed open ocean to do it. Not drifted, but crossed purposefully. There's no passive oceanic drift that reliably deposits a person on a specific island. You cross water with intention or you don't cross it at all. These were seafarers. They had craft and knowledge of currents, and they went somewhere specific. The genetic record of the indigenous Pacific peoples carries traces of two populations that most of us treat as footnotes to human history: the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. Every non-African human carries between 1% and 2% Neanderthal DNA, acquired in interbreeding events in Western Eurasia approximately 50,000 years ago, we surmise. But Aboriginal Australians and Papuans from Papua New Guinea carry a significantly elevated Denisovan signal, up to 5% in some of the tested populations. The Denisovans, a sister lineage identified only from bone fragments found in a Siberian cave in 2010, appear to have had a range far wider than their discoverers expected. The implications is this: the first people in the Pacific probably were not anatomically modern humans in the simple sense. They were compound populations, genetic archives of interspecies contact spanning tens of thousands of years, carrying traits acquired from lineages we've barely named. Traits like improved immune responses, metabolic efficiencies, cold and altitude adaptations picked up in places long since submerged or eroded beyond recognition. Now, all the way across the Pacific Ocean in South America, geneticists have found what they call population Y in the DNA of native indigenous South Americans. A 1% to 2% genomic signal with affinity to Aboriginal Australians and Southeast Asians, and people whose primary ancestry is supposed to trace back through the Bering Land Bridge. These indigenous people appear, genetically speaking, Siberian. That Y signal has no clean explanation. The most conservative reading is shared ancient ancestry, but the geography, Australia on one side of the Pacific, South America on the other, leaves open a door that serious researchers have not been willing to fully explore. People moved. That much we should remember. They moved farther and earlier and more deliberately than our models account for, and some of them may have built 400 concrete cylinders with iron cores on a small island in New Caledonia, for a purpose that a century of archaeology has not resolved yet. When we come back, a man in Colorado Springs in 1899 who had a theory about all of this, though he never heard of the Isle of Pines, and wouldn't have connected it the way I'm about to. Well, he believed the Earth itself was a machine, and he believed he knew how to turn it on. That's part 2. Don't go far. At the moment Thomas Edison was becoming one of the most celebrated men in America, his former employee, a Siberian immigrant named Nikola Tesla, had concluded that Edison's entire system was wrong. Not imperfect, not suboptimal, but just wrong. Edison built direct current power networks, DC power. It flowed in one direction, sort of like water through a pipe. To deliver it to homes and factories, you needed generating stations approximately every mile. Cities would require thousands, if not tens of thousands of them. Every customer was physically tethered to a local source. The infrastructure cost was enormous. The transmission loss over distance was brutal. And Edison, who had the patent portfolio, the investors, and the public name, had committed to it completely. Tesla looked at this and saw a fundamental misunderstanding of what electricity actually was. Alternating current, which changes direction at regular intervals. It could be stepped up and stepped down in voltage using transformers. That meant it could travel hundreds of miles over thin wire with minimal loss. One generating station could serve an entire region. The physics was unambiguous. The evidence was already there in Maxwell's equations. Edison knew Tesla was right. This is the part that tends to get edited out of the schoolbook version of this story. Edison knew Tesla was right, and he fought alternating current in Tesla anyway, because Edison had already spent the money and staked his reputation on DC direct current. The war of currents was not a scientific debate. It was a business decision, wearing a scientist's coat. And alternating current won, even if things were a little more complicated for Tesla. The alternating current system that powers your home right now is, in its foundational architecture, Tesla's. But that's not the Tesla story I want to spend time on today. In 1899, Tesla moved his laboratory from New York to Colorado Springs. He had secured funding and he needed altitude and wide open land for scale. And he was working on a theory that made everything he had done with alternating current look like a preliminary sketch. Tesla, you see, believed the Earth was a resonator, not metaphorically, literally. He believed the planet and the atmosphere together formed a closed electrical system, a cavity that vibrated at a natural frequency, and that if you introduced energy into the system at precisely the right rate, it would propagate globally, not along wires, but through the Earth itself, and through the space between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere. Free power, transmitted wirelessly, available anywhere on the planet. In Colorado Springs, he built the largest Tesla coil ever constructed, a device capable of generating electrical potentials of several million volts, and he conducted experiments that his lab notes describe as producing standing waves in the Earth's crust. He lit electric lamps at distance without wires. He recorded what he believed was the planet's natural resonant frequency. The planet is a resonator, Tesla wrote. Its energy can be tapped, he said. Tesla returned to New York and began the project that was supposed to make him legendary, the Wardenclyffe Tower. You should find photographs of this structure. It was built on Long Island in Shoreham, New York, Long Island, starting in 1901. 187 feet tall, with a copper dome, and going the other direction down into the earth, a shaft drilled 300 feet straight down. The underground portion was as important to Tesla as the tower above. You don't broadcast energy into the sky, Tesla argued. You pump it into the ground. The sky will take care of itself. The design called for a system of iron pipes driven radially into the earth around the central shaft. Conductors making intimate electrical contact with the planet's subsurface at depth. The function, ground the entire electrical system, give the energy somewhere to go, make the circuit complete. A central vertical shaft, 300 feet deep, surrounded by iron conductors radiating outward into the surrounding earth. I'll come back to that architecture and those ratios later. For now, let's hear about Wardenclyffe Tower, the tower that J.P. Morgan funded the first phase of. After that phase, Morgan withdrew the money in 1903. It became clear to him that Tesla's system, if it worked, had no commercial prospects. How do you charge someone for electricity that's available everywhere, in the ground, in the air, for free? The question had an obvious answer, and the answer was, you couldn't. Morgan understood business. He wasn't going to fund a technology that abolished the concept of billing for power. The tower sat unfinished for 14 years. In 1917, the U.S. government ordered it demolished, officially over fears that German intelligence might use it for signals during the war. Tesla was 61 years old. He would spend the next 26 years in a Manhattan hotel, working when he could, feeding pigeons on the roof, dying in debt in January of 1943. Tesla was not a mystic. That distinction matters. Tesla was a rigorous experimentalist who made some of the most consequential discoveries in the history of electrical engineering. When he described standing waves in the Earth's crust, he was reporting instrument readings. His intuition about the ionosphere-to-ground resonant cavity was confirmed by calculation, not by experiment, in 1952, when German physicist W.O. Schumann derived the natural electromagnetic resonant frequencies of precisely that system. The fundamental Schumann resonance is 7.83 Hertz. Tesla had predicted the concept 50 years before Schumann worked out the math. What Schumann did not prove, and what remains unproven, is long-range wireless power transmission at any meaningful scale. The physics of Tesla's proposal encounters serious obstacles. Those would be atmospheric loss, the non-uniformity of soil conductivity, thermodynamic constraints that are not trivial to engineer around. Modern electrical engineers who have studied the Wardenclyffe plans give assessments ranging from theoretically possible but wildly inefficient to fundamentally misconceived in its assumptions. But nobody has tried to build it. What we have built in the last 2 decades is short-range wireless power transfer. It operates on the same basic principle Tesla articulated in his U.S. patent number 645,576, filed in 1897, magnetic resonance coupling. The pad that charges that device on your wrist or in your car without a cable, it's practical, commercial, mundane, and derived in its core principle from a man who died broke in a hotel room. We are using Tesla's idea. We've just been unwilling to scale it. Now I want to return to something I placed in your head a few minutes ago. Wardenclyffe's underground structure, a central vertical shaft 300 feet deep, surrounded by radially extending iron conductors making contact with the Earth at depth. Its stated function was to ground the entire system, to give the energy somewhere to go, to make the circuit complete through the planet itself. The Tumuli Mounds on the Isle of Pines, central vertical shafts, approximately 12 to 20 inches in diameter, reinforced with iron ore, ending in iron cones at the base, some mounds paired and some in oval configuration, dates possibly extending to 12,000 plus years ago. No artifacts, no burials, no cultural detritus. Just the structures. I'm not asserting that the Tumuli Mounds and Wardenclyffe Tower are the same thing. I'm observing that they look like the same principle, a vertical conductor making contact with the Earth's subsurface, iron enforced, designed to either dissipate or concentrate electrical charge at depth. And remember, those mounds are on what's considered an iron plateau. Tesla read Faraday and Maxwell. He did not read Chevalier's 1963 report on New Caledonian tumuli, which had not yet been written when Tesla died, and with which would have been unknown to him in any case. Neither Chevalier nor Golson had any reason to think about Tesla's wireless energy systems. They were archaeologists looking for evidence of culture, and they found none. What they found was an engineering structure without a known purpose. And here is the thing that has stayed with me since I first read about this. Nobody has ever analyzed the Tumuli Mounds for their electromagnetic properties, soil resistivity profiles, or magnetic susceptibility. No one has made a ground-penetrating radar survey of the subsurface below the iron cones, whether the geology beneath them is conductive, whether the site locations correlate with natural electrical gradients in the Earth. None of it's been studied. If those cones sit on conductive mineral deposits, if the soil profiles show patterns consistent with natural telluric current channeling, If the underlying geology is the kind that would make a grounding electrode genuinely functional, well, that would not prove anything, but it would make the mounds considerably more interesting. We have two pieces of our puzzle now: an unexplained grounded iron structure in the South Pacific dating to a period when no organized civilization is supposed to have existed there, and a man who, working independently from first principles in the late 19th century, derived what looks like the same engineering design and almost changed the world with it. In part 3, we're going to a lavender field in southern France. It's July 1965. Because something landed there, and it left a hole. Part 3. The farmer, the field, and French. Men in black. Maurice Massé was 41 years old. He was a lavender farmer. Alpes de Haute-Provence, southeastern France. A region that produces roughly half the world's supply of natural lavender, which means the landscape in early summer is a vision of nature's purple blanket and a scent symphony of a gentle breeze carrying peace, inviting a sweet, fresh floral symphony with a clean edge. Maurice Massé had been farming lavender his entire adult life. He was not an imaginative man, in the sense the word is sometimes meant as a compliment. He was precise, observant, resistant to drama, the kind of man who knows his fields the way a surgeon knows anatomy, not because he loves the knowing, but because his livelihood depends on noticing what has changed. At 5:45 a.m. in the morning on July 1st, 1965, Massé walked into his lavender field, lit a cigarette, and heard a sound that he had not heard before. He described it later repeatedly with consistency. A high, shrill sound, but not mechanical in the way a tractor or helicopter is mechanical. Something in it was wrong for any machine he knew. He moved toward the sound through the rows of lavender. The object was roughly the size of a small car, egg-shaped, blue-gray metal, humming at a frequency he felt more than he heard. It rested on one central support, a rod extending straight down from the underside, planted in the earth, and on 4 to 6 thin, articulated legs surrounding it. The whole assembly held the craft approximately 1.5 yards off the ground. The central support appeared to pivot. The craft could rotate on it. Standing near the craft, examining the lavender plants with focused attention, were 2 figures, Massé says. About 4 feet tall, heads disproportionately large with sharply pointed chins, eyes large and slanted, gray-green suits with no visible seams. They were producing sounds, a grumbling murmur that Massé later described as obviously communicative but entirely unlike language as he understood the term. They were working their way through a row of lavender. One would pull a plant from the soil, examine it, place it back. The other appeared to be recording or sampling. The body language was, in Massé's description, the body language of people looking for something specific. Massé approached to within approximately 5 yards. One of the figures turned and extended an instrument, a small tube, approximately the size and shape of a pencil, and directed it toward him. He was paralyzed from that instant. Fully conscious, unable to move, watching. After 15 to 20 minutes, the figures returned to the craft. A transparent panel slid aside, they entered. The secondary legs retracted, the central support lifted from the ground, the craft rose vertically, then accelerated horizontally and was gone. Silently and at a speed that Massé, a man accustomed to aircraft flying over his fields all the time, had never seen any aircraft achieve. He recovered movement roughly 20 minutes later after the craft departed. He walked to his farmhouse and told his wife what he had seen. That night he slept for 12 hours. For the following weeks, he required 16 to 20 hours of sleep per day. He was not ill in any diagnosable sense. He simply needed sleep in quantities that he had no precedent in his adult life for. The condition persisted for months. Maurice Massey was interviewed by the gendarme, the French Royal Police, within 24 hours of the event. Their written assessment was he was credible, sober, without motive to fabricate, and consistent across multiple independent interviews conducted separately. He was not seeking attention. He gave interviews because investigators requested them, not because he wanted to be believed. In his later years, Massey spoke of the experience rarely and with reluctance. The physical evidence at the site was examined immediately. The legs of the craft had left impressions in the soil, evenly spaced, consistent with the described leg configuration. The soil, in a radius of 6 to 8 meters or yards, consistently described in the gendarmerie report as similar to concrete. Lavender plants in that radius failed to grow normally for years. The local agricultural inspector documented this anomaly. It is in the official record. At the center of the site, where the center support had contacted the ground, a cylindrical hole between 12 to 20 inches wide, 12 to 16 inches deep. The soil inside and immediately around it showed elevated silica crystallization, an unusual molecular structure. Radiating compression marks as if something had rotated under sustained downward pressure. Now, there's an organization called GAIPAN, is the French government body responsible for investigating unidentified aerospace phenomena. It operates under CNES, the French National Space Agency, and maintains formal case classification from identified through PAN-D, which designates cases that remain unexplained following full investigation. In other words, PAN-D are open mysteries. The Valensole case is classified PAN-D. Jacques Vallée, the French-American astronomer and computer scientist who consulted for the U.S. Air Force's Project Blue Book and has spent 50 years applying scientific methods to unexplained aerial phenomena, interviewed Massey personally. His assessment, published in multiple volumes, is measured and specific. Massey was describing his genuine experience as accurately as he was able. What caused that experience, Vallée has consistently refused to speculate about definitively. After all, he is a scientist. He follows the evidence. The evidence says something landed in a lavender field in southeastern France on July 1st, 1965. It left physical traces that persisted for years. Investigators from the French government confirmed those traces. The case has never been resolved. And the central support of that craft left a hole in the ground, cylindrical, 12 to 20 inches wide, 12 to 16 inches deep, with a hardened perimeter and crystallization anomalies in the surrounding soil. The tumuli on the Isle of Pines, central shafts 12 to 20 inches in diameter, reinforced with iron ore, hardened mortar. I want to stop here and say something directly. I'm not telling you what landed in Massey's field. I don't know. Neither do the French government investigators who spent years on this, and neither does Vallée. What I'm telling you is that the Valensole incident is a documented, physically evidenced, officially unresolved event, and that it deserves serious consideration on its own terms, separate from the cultural freight that decades of bad movies have attached to the phrase UFO sighting. And I'm noting as a fact, not as a conclusion, that the physical trace at Valensole includes a cylindrical hole of specific dimensions created by a central vertical pivot mechanism surrounded by soil hardened to unusual consistency in a region of limestone karst through which natural electrical currents move readily. The Alpes de Haute-Provence sits on geology with elevated calcium content. So does the mortar in the Isle of Pines tumuli. The lavender field sits over porous karst, rock through which water and electromagnetic current move in ways that differ markedly from solid geology. I don't know what to do with that information other than document it here in our podcast. Neither does anyone else, but the information is true, and it exists. And the two beings in Massey's field were not randomly browsing. They were examining his lavender plants with the systematic attention of people following a protocol, row by row, plant by plant, looking for something that either was or wasn't there. Massey said that they appeared to have left satisfied. Coming up in the final part, the oldest map in the world, which is written in your DNA, and what 300,000 years of human movement across this planet tells us about everything we've discussed today, and why the answer to the central question here might not be about what was there, but about who we have always been. That's part 4. Stay close. Part 4. The map in our blood. 300,000 years. That is the current best estimate for how long anatomically modern humans have existed as a distinct species. The oldest confirmed fossils, recovered from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco and published in Nature in 2017, date to approximately 315,000 years ago. These were not our ancestors in some vague ancestral sense. They were us. The skull architecture is slightly different in the posterior region, but a physical anthropologist looking at those remains would say without hesitation, this is a human. 300,000 years resists real comprehension. Written language is approximately 5,000 years old, agriculture about 12,000 years old, and the oldest confirmed concrete in the archaeological record is around 2,300 years old. At least that's what we believe now. The Tumuli Mounds on the Isle of Pines, at their most conservative dating, are roughly 3,000 years old. At their oldest, as indicated by scientific dating, they're more than 13,000 years old. Even at 13,000 years, we're talking about the final 4% of our 300,000 year human history. For the other 96%, people walked. We're told that the first modern humans left Africa in multiple waves beginning approximately 70,000 years ago, based on the genetic evidence. Though there were almost certainly earlier dispersals that left less traceable DNA signals. They moved north through the Levant, east across the breadth of Asia, eventually reaching what is now Australia by at least 65,000 years ago. Reaching Australia was not trivial. Even at Pleistocene sea levels, a significant open water crossing was required. Not a land bridge, not a short hop. Whoever made that crossing to Australia had craft capable of sustained ocean travel and sufficient navigational knowledge to reach a specific landmass reliably. They weren't washed ashore. They arrived. In the course of these migrations, modern humans encountered and interbred with at least 2 other hominin populations, the Neanderthals, who had occupied Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, and Denisovans, a population we have identified almost entirely from genetic evidence, with physical remains so sparse, a few teeth and fragments of finger bone from a single Siberian cave, that their geography and appearance remain largely inferred. Every non-African human carries between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA. These were not isolated encounters. The interbreeding events happened over millennia in multiple locations, and they transferred traits with real adaptive value, immune responses to pathogen environments that Neanderthals had been navigating for 400,000 years. Cold climate metabolic efficiencies, immune gene variants that we still carry and still use. We did not simply replace the Neanderthals, we absorbed them. They are, in the most literal genetic sense, still inside us. And the Denisovan signal is stranger, and in some ways more significant. Aboriginal Australians and Papuans carry Denisovan DNA at up to 5%, more than twice the Neanderthal proportion. And the Denisovans, based on the few remains we have, were apparently a Siberian population, yet their genetic signal is strongest in precisely the communities that have been in the Pacific the longest. The resolution of this paradox, most researchers believe, is that there was a Denisovan population in Southeast Asia or Oceania, distinct from or overlapping with the Siberian Denisovans that encountered modern humans as they moved through the region. We have not found the bones yet. The Pacific is a huge place. Preservation conditions in tropical environments are poor. We have been doing serious ancient DNA work for less than 20 years. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The gene frequency data is clear regardless. The populations that were first in the Pacific carry the strongest archaic signal. Whatever the Denisovans were, and we do not fully know, their descendants occupy some of the most ancient human communities on Earth. Then there's population Y. In 2015, a team led by geneticist Pontus Skoglund published a paper in Nature reporting a genomic signal in certain indigenous South American populations, specifically the Suri and the Caratania of Brazil, that could not be accounted for by the standard Beringian migration model. A small but statistically robust fraction of their ancestry showed closer affinity to Aboriginal Australians and Papuans than to any Northeast Asian or Siberian population. They named it Population Y. The letter Y is a placeholder. It means unknown source. The dominant model for the peopling of the Americas posits one primary migration through the Bering Land Bridge approximately 15 to 20,000 years ago, with possible subsequent waves. That model accounts for the vast majority of Native American ancestry, but it does not account for population Y. The proposed explanations range from a coastal migration along the Pacific Rim by a population carrying Australasian genetic signal to an earlier entry into the Americas by a distinct group that was largely absorbed by subsequent arrivals. Neither explanation is fully satisfying. Both require something we have not yet found evidence for. What the data requires, at a minimum, is this. The peopling of the Americas was more complicated than the schoolbook version. There was not one wave of people who crossed the land bridge. There were multiple populations, moving at different times by routes we are still mapping, carrying the genetic signatures of encounters that stretch back across 100,000 years at least. And they were not wandering. This is the thing I keep returning to. 28,000 years ago, someone crossed open ocean to reach a specific island in the Solomon chain. 65,000 years ago, a human population made a sustained sea crossing to reach Australia. 15,000 years ago at least, people were in South America, and some of them carried genetic material from populations on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. These were navigators. They studied currents, stars, wind patterns, and seasonal cycles with the concentrated attention that survival demands across generations. They organized labor at scale. They built things we haven't found yet, and they left very little behind. Not because they were primitive, but probably because they built mostly organic things out of wood, fiber, thatch, and hide. These are materials that typically don't survive 10,000 years in tropical conditions. What might survive in the right geological context is stone, fired earth, and of course, iron-reinforced concrete, iron cones, iron rings. Let me bring the four threads together, and I'll do it plainly. On the Isle of Pines, There are 400 structures of unknown purpose. They are iron-reinforced concrete cylinders with vertical shafts, iron rings in some, designed to make contact with the Earth's subsurface. Their date is disputed, but potentially very ancient. The people who occupied that region, based on the Solomon Islands evidence, were capable of open water navigation more than 28,000 years ago. The oral traditions of the Kanak say these structures were not built by their ancestors. They were already there when the ancestors arrived. In Tesla's work, completed in isolation, working from electromagnetic first principles, we find an independent derivation of what those structures suggest: a vertical ground electrode as part of a system for interacting with the Earth's natural electrical potential. Tesla didn't know about the Isle of Pines. He reasoned his way to a structurally similar design from Maxwell's equations and his own experiments. He built the same thing in different materials in 1901. In a lavender field in southeastern France in 1965, a documented and officially unresolved event produced a central support hole of dimensions consistent with the Isle of Pines shafts in soil with elevated calcium content over porous limestone through which electrical current moves readily. And two figures who appeared to be systematically sampling the local plant life with a specificity that suggests prior knowledge of what they were looking for. And running through all of it, the genetic record of a species that has been moving, mixing, and building for 300,000 years, carrying the traces of populations we barely named, connecting continents in ways our models still don't fully account for. I am not handing you a conclusion today. I want to be clear about that. The tumuli might be water storage infrastructure. The dates might be contaminated, and they might be 3,000 years old. Tesla's theory of global wireless power might be fundamentally unworkable at scale. The Valensole incident might have an explanation that Maurice Masse never knew about. Some atmospheric plasma event or some experimental military aircraft operating on principles not yet declassified, some perceptual phenomenon that science hasn't characterized yet. And population Y might dissolve as ancient DNA sample sizes grow and the models improve. Any of those things might be true. What I'm giving you is the shape of a question. The question is this: what if our understanding of ancient human capability is significantly wrong? What if the 96% of human history that preceded writing is not simply a void, but a story we have not yet learned to read? The mounds are still there. The lavender field is still there. Your DNA is there. And somewhere in the historical archive of Long Island, there are plans for a tower that was torn down before it was finished. The legendary comedian and performer George Burns used to say that the secret to a good story is knowing where to stop. Burns told stories until he was 99 years old, and he was right about this. You don't finish a story. You find the place where it wants to keep going without you, and you step back. This is that place. And so for now, I have just one last good story for you. What Marie knew. I said at the top of episode 0 that every episode ends with one last good story. This is that story. It's set in the world we just walked through together, the Isle of Pines, the mounds, the science, the questions that don't have clean answers yet. But this one is about people, which is where every good story eventually lands anyway. The old woman sat in the same chair she had sat in for 40 years, a wide wicker chair on the covered porch of a house that faced the sea and had been rebuilt twice since her husband built the original. But always on the same piece of ground, always facing the same direction. She said the ground chose her house. Her husband had believed her. Her son had humored her. Her grandson had grown up thinking it was simply how his family talked about things, as if the land had opinions. His name, the grandson, was Étienne. He was 34 years old and had been away from the Isle of Pines for 11 years. He had a doctorate from the University of Auckland in geophysics, and he had spent the last decade studying electromagnetic properties of volcanic rock formations in New Zealand, which is what he had told himself his career was all about. His colleagues would have described his specialty differently. His specialty was listening to the Earth. He arrived on a Tuesday in March carrying 2 hard-sided equipment cases in a backpack and the particular guilt of a man who has been planning to come home for 3 years and is only now doing it. His grandmother was at the airport. She was 81 and had made her daughter drive her, and she stood at the barrier with her arms crossed and her chin slightly elevated. The way she stood when she had been right about something and was allowing others the dignity of figuring that out for themselves. "You brought the equipment?" she said. Not a question. "Yes, Grandma. For the Mounds?" He had not told her why he was coming. He had said he was coming to visit. She was 81 and had never once in his memory confused what she was told with what she knew. "Yes," he said, "for the Mounds." She uncrossed her arms. She patted his face with one hand, the way she had when he was 8. Then she turned and walked toward the car. "Good," she said over her shoulder. "It's past time." Marie Poitea had been telling the story of the Mounds since before Étienne was born. Since before his father was born. She had learned it from her own grandmother, who had learned it from hers, and the chain of telling went back to a place that was not a date, but a feeling. The sense of things that had always been true, transmitted not as history, but as weather. You don't explain rain. You know it's coming because you've learned to read the air. The Mounds in her telling were not mysterious. They were purposeful. They had been placed by people who understood something about where energy moved through the ground. Her word was not energy, it was older than that, closer in meaning to breath or current or the thing that moves between deep water and the surface. She could not tell you what the structures were for precisely. She could tell you that they were not tombs, not monuments, not territorial markers. They were functional. Like a well is functional, or a road. She had said this to the French archaeologists in 1959. She had been 36, and she had stood in the road while Luc Chevalier's team worked on the damaged mound, and she had told them in careful French that the structures were not religious in nature and that the iron at the base was deliberate. Chevalier had thanked her and written in his notebook and published a paper 4 years later that quoted oral tradition in a single subordinate clause. She had not been angry. She had been patient. She was patient the way the plateau was patient. Because she knew that eventually someone would find a way to ask the question properly. She had just not expected it to take 60 years, and she had not expected it to be her own grandson. But she was not surprised. Étienne spent 4 days on the plateau with his equipment. He worked at dawn and in the late afternoon when the light was low and the heat was manageable. And he slept in his grandmother's house and ate what she cooked and listened to her talk in the evenings, the way he had when he was young. She did not ask what he was finding. She told him stories. She told him about her mother, who had walked the perimeter of the Mounds every dry season, placing her hands on the gravel and closing her eyes. Not praying. Not praying. His grandmother was clear about this. Listening. His mother's mother had said you could feel something in certain positions relative to certain mounds at certain times of day. Not a vibration exactly, more like the feeling of standing next to a large body of water without being able to see it. A sense of presence, of something nearby that was larger than what was visible. Étienne had his own word for what she was describing, telluric current. Natural electrical charge moving through the upper crust of the Earth, driven by the interaction of solar wind with the geomagnetic field and by the simple fact that the planet's interior is hot and the surface is not, and energy always moves from more to less. You could not feel it as a rule, But if you were standing directly above a high conductivity formation, say an iron-rich geological intrusion, and your body had become attuned over a lifetime to small sensory input in a quiet place, you might register something. People did. It was documented. Farmers and navigators and indigenous communities on multiple continents had demonstrated repeatedly a capacity to detect things that instrumentation later confirmed. His grandmother's mother had been feeling the current. He did not tell Marie this until the fourth evening. He sat at the table where he had done his homework as a child and opened his laptop and showed her the soil resistivity profiles. She studied them for a long time without speaking. She was not a geophysicist, but she was a woman who had spent 80 years paying close attention to a specific piece of the earth, and she understood maps. There, she said, pointing to a cluster of anomalies on the screen. Those three, the ones in the triangle. My mother said those ones sang. The three mounds she was pointing to sat directly above the strongest telluric current concentration in the entire survey. The highest conductivity formation on the plateau. The place where, if you're going to site a ground electrode system, an installation designed to make electrical contact with the planet's subsurface, you would put it. He looked at her for a moment. "Grandma," he said, "how did she know?" Marie looked at him with the particular patience of someone who had been waiting a very long time for a question, and who is now glad it has finally arrived. "She listened," she said. "Same as her mother. Same as hers." She closed the laptop gently and stood up and put the kettle on. He presented his findings at a conference in Auckland 6 weeks later. The paper he had submitted in advance was titled Electromagnetic Anomaly Profiles and Subsurface Conductivity Mapping of the Isle of Pines Complex, New Caledonia. It was a technical document with methodology sections and error ranges and the measured, hedged language of peer-reviewed science. The presentation was a little different. He stood at the lectern and he showed the data, the resistivity profiles, the conductivity maps, the correlation analysis between mound placement and subsurface electrical gradients, and the room was the politely skeptical room that scientific conferences tend to be, full of people who had seen extraordinary claims before and had learned to wait. Then he put up a photograph. It was an old photograph, black and white. A woman standing at the edge of one of the mounds with her hands pressed flat to the gravel and her eyes closed. His grandmother's mother, 1947. Someone had taken it and it had sat in a box in Marie's house for 75 years. This woman, Étienne said, could locate the highest conductivity formations on this plateau by touch, with an accuracy that my survey equipment confirmed to within approximately 2 meters. He let that sit for a moment in the room's quiet. She was not guessing. She was not performing. She had been taught by her mother, who was taught by hers, to pay a specific kind of attention to a specific piece of ground, and that attention, transmitted through generations of oral tradition, preserved functional knowledge that the published archaeological record has not, in 60 years, managed to recover. He advanced the slide, the conductivity map. 400 mounds, the triangle of 3 that sang. I'm not here to tell you what these structures were used for. That question remains open. What I'm here to tell you is that whoever built them knew exactly where to put them. They understood the subsurface electrical properties of that plateau with a precision that I can confirm with contemporary instrumentation, and that has been orally preserved with accuracy by the indigenous community of that island for at least a century of documented history, and almost certainly much longer. The woman in the photograph is named Waja. I never met her. She died in 1971. Her daughter, who is 81 years old, is sitting in a house on the Isle of Pines now, and she already knows what this data says. She knew before I did. The room was different after that. It had the quality of a room in which something had shifted. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, but the way a lock sounds when the right key finds it. A small, definitive click. He called from the hotel that evening. It was late in Auckland and early on the island, and she answered on the second ring because she had been awake. "How did it go?" she asked. "They listened," he said. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite satisfaction, something that lived between the two. "You showed them Waja?" "Yes." "Good." She would have liked that. She was always very patient about being ignored. He sat on the edge of the hotel bed in the dark and thought about telling her about the DNA results, the peripheral finding that his university's lab had generated when they ran the soil samples, which had led, in the way that scientific curiosity has of following its own threads, to a broader conversation about ancient Pacific genetics, which had led to a research collaboration, which had led quietly and somewhat to his own surprise to this discovery that Étienne Poitea carried a genomic signal consistent with population Y. That small, unexplained fraction, the Australasian echo found in communities from the Pacific to South America, the piece of the human story that the models don't fully account for yet. He was not just descended from people who had been in New Caledonia for generations. He was descended through some chain of encounters too ancient to trace from people who had moved across the largest ocean on Earth and left their mark in the DNA of communities on both sides of it. His grandmother's people had been part of the movement, part of the great human fact of continuous, purposeful migration that rewrote the planet's population over 300,000 years. He carried the record of it in his cells. He decided this could wait for morning, for the porch and the chair and her tea and the sea. "Grandma," he said instead, "I want to come back for a while if that's all right." The pause before she answered was very short, one beat, the length of time it takes an 81-year-old woman to stop herself from saying, "I knew you would." "The room is ready," she said. "It's been ready." She kept the room ready for 3 years, not because she had information, because she had paid attention to her grandson and to her ground and to the long patience required to hold a true thing open until the world is ready to receive it, which is, when you think about it, what oral tradition has always been. Not the past refusing to let go, the past making sure the door stays open. Thank you for spending this time with me. If something in today's story lit a fuse for you, if you want to read Golson's 1961 report or the Gaipan Valensole classification, or the 2015 Nature paper on population Y or Tesla's patent 645576, I'll have the references in the show notes. These are primary sources. Read them yourself. Form your own view. This was episode 0. There are more stories where this came from. This is One Last Good Story with me, Bill McDade. Stories worth telling and people worth knowing.